Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to introduce myself. Claus Döring is the name. I am chief editor of the German Börsenzeitung, financial newspaper, and it is my great honor to chair the panel this afternoon. Will Europe fail? Is Europe failing? When you look at the developments in London, Brussels, Athens and other European capitals, this is a question which many people are mooting at the moment. And in fact, people are asking this more and more at the moment. But very often, it's not raised as a question, I must say. The question is, what about the Europeans on the street, the politicians, economists, financial experts here today? They've all got more and more doubts about Europe and the euro area. Is it moving in the right direction? People have misgivings about the financial architecture of Europe, especially of the Euroland. Is it still fit? Is it still suitable? There are doubts as to whether the statics of the European home as it stands at the moment will manage to weather the crisis, especially when you consider the sovereign debt crisis of recent years. The questions relating to the institutions, their role and their interaction, or competition rather, among them are issues we looked at this morning from the scientific point of view, from the academic point of view. And above all, we feel we've got to add another element to this by focusing on the political answers, because it is the policymakers, the politicians, who set the rules for the interaction of the institutions. At the end of the day, the political community shoulders responsibility for the functioning of the rules of the game in Euroland and in the EU, especially vis-à-vis their electorate in the different countries. And apart from Greece, of course, there are 18 further countries in the Eurozone. And over and above this, in the European electorate as a whole, represented in the European Parliament. So, it is my honor to introduce two of the most experienced politicians in Europe to discuss these matters together and with us. It's a great honor, and indeed we're all very pleased that these two ministers have managed to come here today at these very turbulent times when one crisis summit follows another. So thank you to them for coming to the Bundesbank Conference here in Frankfurt today. Welcome to Minister Sapin, and welcome to Minister Schäuble. Ladies and gentlemen, before turning to the subject matter as such, just a few housekeeping points. First of all, the two ministers will give us a keynote statement, an introductory statement, and then we shall have a dialogue going into further detail. And the last 20 minutes of this session will be an open dialogue, a Q&A. So during the discussion, you can perhaps note down any questions you may like to put. So I would urge you to take the floor later on and engage in a discussion on this very exciting time of the European process. Many people say it is, in fact, one of the most important milestones since the treaties of Rome were signed. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the two ministers from the news. Nevertheless, let me briefly introduce them. Mr. Sapin and Mr. Schäuble have known each other for some time now. They've known each other for about 10 years, I know. And I think they get on pretty well, actually, although they come from a different political background. Monsieur Sapin is a close confidant of President Hollande, the French president, and for the last 40 years he's been a member of the Socialist Party of France. Some people say he's from the left wing of the Socialist Party in France, but you could perhaps comment on that. President Hollande and Mr. Sapin have known each other since they were at university because they studied together at the elite university ENA. They started off there in 1980, and Mr. Sapin, in fact, studied literature before then. However, he began his political career in 1981, and parallel with this, that was at national level, he was in a number of municipal roles. He joined the parliament in 1991, and in 1992 he was finance minister under Pierre Périgord, the French prime minister at the time, before he assumed different duties in 2012, when Hollande won the elections. Mr. Sapin was first of all Minister of Labour, and then last April he switched to the financial portfolio. As a journalist, it has struck me that as soon as he was in office, along with Mr. Schäuble, he gave a joint newspaper interview. I remember this because in this interview, Mr. Sapin said that he would in fact pay for 4 crates of champagne if he won a bet with respect to the future. Anyway, it doesn't look as if he's going to have to pay for the crate of champagne, but he has been Minister of Finance for about a year now, whereas Mr. Schäuble has been German Finance Minister since 2009. So he, in fact, has more time to work on a balanced budget. As you know, he succeeded Mr. Steinbrück as finance minister in the second Merkel cabinet, and he has in fact been such a high profile that we perhaps forget that previously he was a member of parliament and he was responsible for a lot of other portfolios. To mention just a few, ladies and gentlemen, you may not know this, Mr. Schäuble has been a member of the German parliament since '72. So this is his the 12th parliament, and in fact he is the senior member of the Bundestag. In fact, no one has ever been a member of parliament for any longer than he has. So yes, a round of applause for that. It's a record. He has held a whole raft of offices in these long years. I'm not going to list them, otherwise it would take me until this evening. But he played an important role, as you know, when Germany was reunified. He was Minister of the Interior before switching to the finance portfolio. In Germany, in opinion polls, he's nearly as popular and acknowledged as the Chancellor. This is rather unusual for a finance minister. Mr. Schäuble, you're not so popular in Greece, however, as we can see from the opinion polls. But I'm very close with Ms. Merkel there as well concerning my popularity in Greece, says the minister. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, I'd like to give Mr. Sapin the floor for his introductory statement. Just after the election in Greece in February, Mr. Sapin made an interesting statement, which I think is of particular importance again today. He said that France was the link between Brussels and Athens, in the conflict between Brussels and Athens. And Mr. Tsipras has now come up with a new reform blueprint, which in fact were put together with a French consultant. He's going to take these to Brussels. So perhaps you could tell us, how do you see the role of France in the current situation in the euro area? And of course, the key issue we want to talk about today is how can Europe be safeguarded against future crises, and how should policymakers, or what role can policymakers play here? Thank you very much. I'll just let everyone put on their headsets. And I know that some of you understand French. Mr. Schäuble, for example, he very often speaks French with me, and I know he understands it. It was really important for me to be with you this afternoon, despite the events. Number one, because it's here, and by the way, thank you, President Weidmann, for inviting me here. I have been familiar with the Bundesbank for a long time. In '92, as you said, I was Minister of Finance, and there was the crisis at the time. That is when the single European currency saw the light of day, just after the adoption of Maastricht, Treaty of Maastricht. And I would say, you know, that the crisis we're going through today is pretty weak when you consider the crisis we managed to weather very well in the past, when you consider the crisis between France and Germany and the crisis we had with respect to the Bundesbank fighting for its independence and also its willingness for cooperation. And I'd like to say good afternoon to a number of people who were members of the Governing Council of the Bundesbank at the time, among others Mr. Tietmeyer. I'm also very pleased to be here today because despite any differences we may have, Wolfgang Schäuble and I have been working together for a year to bring forward Europe. Of course, our peoples are different, our histories are different, our institutions are different, but nevertheless, what we want to focus on is trying to find a solution, and we want to focus on the Franco-German dialogue, and indeed, in the debate, we want to put forward a number of joint proposals, Franco-German proposals. And as you know, Wolfgang and I, we have put forward joint proposals in the context of the dialogue or the discussions with the five presidents in the first report put forward. Now, you said that I was from the left wing of the Socialist Party. Now, some of you maybe are rather afraid of a Socialist Party. The Social Democrats, of course, are in government with Wolfgang at the moment. When the ministers of the economy or the finance ministers meet, Wolfgang always says to me, you know, I've only got friends around me. But I know that he always manages to assert his opinion. Now, to come to the substance of this matter, which of course goes beyond the issue of Greece. If you wish, we can talk about Greece, but there's one decisive matter in the current context, given changes that Europe is going through and the changes worldwide, the opening that Europe has gone through and all our countries are going through, when you consider our European construction, our European project and the single European currency, can it respond to the big challenges out there? Can it weather the crisis? That is the question. The crisis that we're going through now at the moment is not a crisis if you look at this from the outside. Look back on 2008 or 2009, that was different. But I would say that today's crisis, that's my analysis at least, is in fact generated by the weaknesses of the setup of the Eurozone and also the lack of a collective approach to managing the problems. So, to be frank, to be honest, if we don't try to window dress the obstacles, this is what you will really see. So, I think there are two key questions we've got to ask. One, does Europe at the moment have sound instruments to protect itself from the crises, no matter what crisis it may be? Question number two, do we have the right method to act together and to roll out these instruments? Now, I'd just like to try and give you a few ideas. I'm, of course, not trying to answer all the questions, just going to flag some ideas. Today, We have a number of tools which were established in recent years, which are very useful and can be very effective. We do, in fact, have shields within Euroland, and in fact we have got the solidarity instruments to face crisis, and at the same time we want to reinforce rules and supervision, budgetary supervision, and also we want to protect ourselves against macroeconomic problems. I'd like to stress the action of the ECB since the very onset of the crisis in terms of both financial stability and in more recent months in terms of support of economic activity, has in fact taken the right decisions. Although I know that this is debatable, and of course that's quite natural. This is part and parcel of the necessary debate you've got to have before you decide what the right decisions are. Now, in my opinion, we have got to shore up our capacity to face shocks. The banking union, of course, is a way of making sure that we can, in fact, have a right bond between banking supervision and banking risks. The union of capital markets must have two aims. It must aim the financing of the economy, SMEs, etc. But we must also reduce the financial risk so that we can, in fact, have a better means of absorbing shocks in the private sector. Then, of course, there is the action of the central banks, because this, of course, is a question of facilitating the acceptance of monetary policy across the economy. So we've got to work on building a common tool to absorb shocks. And this is what we're talking about within the Euro land. We've got to work on the preconditions to set up these tools, which are not that simple. We've also got to consider the type of expenditure and income which would make sense, and those which will be dealt with not at national level, but at European level. Last but not least, we have got to work towards growth and convergence among our economies. Convergence is indispensable. We all know that within Euroland, we in fact are at a level of the GDP which is hardly above those before the crisis. So balanced budgetary strategies are necessary. Efforts are necessary at European level to boost investment. This is absolutely indispensable. However, as I've said, it's a question of the convergence of the Euroland economies. We've got to make sure that we can have those countries catch up with the others. You know, the EU is much more divergent than it was 15 years ago. At the level of coordinating short-term monetary policies, structural measures are indispensable, and measures must be taken to move forward here, for example, in the fiscal area, to ensure that this convergence will in fact be higher than at the moment. So much for my questions on the tools which we already have and the tools which must be fine-tuned. It's also a question of the method to be applied, to work together, to act together. What do we need? We need rules, rules, rules. As Wolfgang would say in English, we need rules, and the rules must be complied with. But we also need intelligent application of rules. We must adapt to circumstances and the type of crisis to find the right responses to these crises, which may differ. We need intelligence in applying the rules so that we can introduce strategies which are the right ones to strike the right balance between indispensable budgetary consolidation, and this is very important for my country, and to boost growth. In France, we want to get back to the 3% deficit as soon as possible, and to do so credibly. At the same time, we have got to boost the return to growth, which in fact we have managed to achieve in the beginning of 2015. But secondly, concerning the method again, I think we have got to adopt an aggregate approach within Euroland to make sure that we have a shared vision among policymakers and financial experts. This applies to the budgetary policy, so that we have an aggregate vision and can apply the rules rigorously, if necessary, the rules applicable to each country. At the same time, we've got to consider structural reform. We've got to have a common political approach to identify the structural policies which are necessary in general, and then which must be applied in a differentiated manner on the basis of the needs of the various countries, how far they're behind, so that national policies will be coherent and will be in line with a common pan-European objective. Moreover, we've also got to work towards an increased integration in terms of regulation at European level. This applies to the free circulation of capital. It applies to the financial sector in Europe. The regulators, national regulators, may, of course, be there, but also international regulators must be able to manage these flows. We've got to consider the question of European regulation to find the right level in terms of supervision. This is why, of course, we now have the common banking supervision rules. This is in compliance with the free circulation of workers, and it's also a question which is important concerning the fight against tax fraud, and we are working very closely with Wolfgang, Spain and Italy on this. We've got to have fiscal tax systems which in fact will offer enterprises the possibility to develop. However, we don't want to have companies that pay tax neither here, there or anywhere. This is rather shocking. So I'll just wrap up by referring back to the crisis back in the early 90s when I was a fledgling finance minister, and I can recall the crisis almost minute by minute. It was so intense, you know. And of course, on the basis of experience as well, and on the basis of the path we have in fact gone through in Europe since the last war, I have really understood how important the Franco-German tandem is decisive. Theo Weigel was finance minister at the time, and we had a very good relationship. So it doesn't matter if you're from different political ilk, you can still work together. This goes beyond the question of political ideology, because you focus on what is more important than just individual points. You've got to consider what we are all working for as an overall aim. This is much more important than our own careers. But beyond the Franco-German tandem, the idea is to create confidence. This is indispensable. Sometimes it's confidence which must be built between people. This doesn't mean that you've got to negate differences. Even if there are differences, you can have confidence in someone. And thinking about the situation with respect to Greece over the last few months, I think this is what was really missing over the last few months, or even the last few weeks. Confidence, to get people to take the right decisions, to come together, to converge, and this is a confidence we need. We need this at the moment in the hours, the days ahead, we've got to re-establish a basis of confidence, of trust. Because perhaps years after year, commitments were made concerning the fact that taxes would be imposed, certain privileges would be done away with, and this was perhaps not done. So we've got to build this confidence over and above the general problems so that the budgetary situation can be improved. We've got to have greater integration in the future. And of course, it's a question of institutional reform here, but it's above all a question of this confidence, which must be the heart of everything. And you've got to stand up for this confidence. And if the confidence is not there, it's got to be re-established so that we can overcome today's crisis and indeed the crises of tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Sapin, for this tour d'horizon. There are 4 issues that you mentioned that I deem particularly important, and I'm sure that we're going to come back to them during the discussion. One was the question of the right tools, the right methodology, then the question of rules, as you said, and then the question of trust, which basically plays such an important part these days. But now I'd like to give Minister Schäuble the opportunity of responding, or else to give his input from his point of view, so that we can see where the common perspectives are. That is something that Minister Sapin stressed in his speech, or also to show us where there may be differences of interpretation relating to the deepening of European unity. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Döring. Ladies and gentlemen, I will try and be brief in my remarks. I don't want to give an input statement. I would like to answer directly concerning your questions, and also I'd like to come back to what Michel Sapin just said. So let me start out by saying, well, it's great to have you here in Frankfurt, and it feels really good to meet in Frankfurt and not just in Luxembourg or Brussels, as we usually do. Next week, I think, we'll meet in Paris, Strasbourg, Berlin, and of course we see each other every day in Brussels in these days to come. Now, I have to say that there is indeed agreement in most points. We agree that the real problems we are facing at this moment, of course, are related to the peculiarities of the European Monetary Union. And what we knew when we initiated this monetary union wasn't enough, and now is the time to strengthen this project. So this is actually our task today. Now, the crisis triggered by Greece is one thing. Of course, we have the report of the 5 presidents as a basis for our future work. Now, I totally agree as well that, of course, France and Germany mustn't be the dominating countries in Europe. There is no such thing as a Franco-German dominance. That would be absurd. But we have a joint leadership in European affairs, and this has worked very well over time. Whenever there were different views among the various players, I think that Helmut Schmidt got along with Monsieur Giscard d'Estaing, of course. And Schmidt and Mitterrand, well, we know about them, and I think Angela Merkel and François Hollande, of course, they get along well as well, notwithstanding the fact that she also got along well with Mr. Sarkozy. Now, Of course, I would have my problems with the minister from left-wing German party, but that's of course not the case here, and that's our common understanding. And when things get tricky, of course we have our differences, and it would be really strange if that wasn't the case. But I'm sure we will always be looking for joint solutions. The second remark is the following. Some weeks ago, Mr. Weidmann and myself had the honor of hosting an informal meeting, a two-day meeting of the G7 central banks, governors and finance ministers in Dresden. And well, we wouldn't have thought it possible at first, but we managed to do it. And for half a day, we talked to the leading economists of various opinions, Orbini, Caruana. So I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the people who were there. Bob Schiller was there, of course. So we discussed intensively, and you know, whenever Larry Summers is there, he won't play on the sidelines. That's a normal thing for him.
Und muss sie gekämpft werden, dadurch, dass die öffentliche Hand mehr Demand macht?
It was a question of public interference, public intervention, and of course there is less growth today than 20 years ago. The dynamism of the economy has slowed down, and this is not just because of the euro crisis. That's utter nonsense. China has not a lot to do with Greece, if I'm not mistaken, I have to say. There are a few significant differences, however, and discussions in the Anglo-Saxon and non-Anglo-Saxon region differ here. So there is a small fraction of the world, I have to say, that is not dominated by the Anglo-Saxons, and there are certain differences in opinion and in perspectives. And of course, we saw these differences in the debates in Dresden, and we couldn't overcome them there. But one thing was clear. It's not with the means of monetary policy that we can generate lasting growth. So I think there was complete consensus concerning this question. What matters are investments, and what is even more important is ongoing structural reforms. And that's not just relating to the labor market. Of course, the labor market, of course, competitiveness and mobility, globalization. That's a huge challenge, of course, for labor markets, but it also relates to the opening of markets, generally speaking, so competitiveness in general. And that leads me to my second remark. Something that is not perceived outside the European Monetary Union is that, you know, the two of us were there at the very beginning of this story, and I see a few faces in this room. I can't see many of you here, but I know that some of you were there at the time, and not everybody was thrilled at the time. We knew that a monetary union without a political union, fiscal union, would be something of a risky undertaking in the long run. It would be an understatement saying that when it comes to the sustainability of monetary unions. But the discussion of whether we shouldn't have started out with a political union can be had as well. And on the other hand, I think it wouldn't have been possible the other way around. It was just the same with German reunification. There was the question of whether we shouldn't have a general reunion discussing a general constitution and these things. Well, I'm sure that we wouldn't have made the same progress. Now, even before the failure of the first political union, that was the European Defense Community, it failed because it was too early after the Second World War, speaking about abandoning sovereignty in this field, getting together with Germany so early after the war. And then we said we have to come up with the right rules and tools, and we have them and wanted them because we intended to comply with them, and we didn't do that. And it wasn't just the Greeks, they weren't even there at the time when Germany and France already violated the Stability Pact. So Greece wasn't even a member of the euro then. So we made mistakes as well. And then we strengthened this framework of rules, and we made some progress until the repercussions of the banking crisis, which didn't originate in the euro area, but elsewhere in the world, but which overthrew all the applying rules of fiscal policymakers. And at that time, we understood how fragile the Eurozone is, and markets did what they usually do. They react late, but in too forced a way. And since 2009, we've been dealing with the euro crisis, and we were more successful than we had hoped in 2010, 2011. And that's the truth. Now, I could go on for hours telling you a story of what we did about Greece. You know, everybody said, haircut, let's not do that. And, you know, looking at timelines that were completely unconceivable for the IMF in 2012. So all of that went much better than anybody would have thought. And that's history. Now we have to try and make sure that the European Monetary Union is strengthened, the banking union has progressed, and I totally agree with Minister Sapin. We worked hard towards it, and it happened much more quickly than is usual in Europe. But the banking union isn't completed yet. And let me just give you an example. Everybody says, and we've learned as much, that of course the risks emanating from national budgets must be made separate from risks emanating from the banking sector. And this is why I think it's a very good thing that the report of the five presidents for the first time speaks about how sovereign debt is actually to be dealt with. And I think this is a development we have to start carefully, but we have to go into this direction. And that also includes other projects of separating risks in a better fashion. But if we take a look at the risks of national governments and separating them from the risks emanating from the banking sector, it doesn't make any sense to come up with terms like restructuring fund, bridge financing, deposit guarantees, schemes, what have you. It doesn't make any sense to take the risk of national governments and banks on the other hand. We mustn't push the risk from one national government to another. And this is why we need to take the most important steps and make sure that everybody has to assume the risks for their own households. And this is why we have come up with the bail-in rules, and we have to make sure that everybody implements them. And if we progress further towards a banking union, this is exactly what we have to do. We have to separate risks and not just push the risk of one government over to a community of nations. That's not the solution. The solution would be to make a very clear cut here. That is true for the capital union, and it also goes for a joint backstop. Now, the ESM was a first step in the right direction. We came up with very strict terms for it, because a monetary union, especially when you have players that don't stick to the rules and that don't want to stick to any rules and that actually declared that they don't want to stick to the rules, even if we thought in a bona fide fashion that we could convince them to stick to the rules. But a monetary union constructed like ours is nothing but an invitation for somebody who doesn't intend to stick to the rules, and that's what you call moral hazard. And this is why the moral hazard question may be overrated in the Anglo-Saxon environment. Tim Geithner, for example, tended to say that I told him, you don't understand the problems of the European Monetary Union, but we have to take these factors into account, and it either works or we can't do it. Of course, trust can replace many things. That is true, and we're working towards that goal again and again. Trust can be found even if you have different opinions, and compromise can be found. But I would like to give you another practical example to show you what I'm talking about. Last Tuesday, I think we had a meeting for the last time of the Eurozone. So last meeting for the time being, I have to say, and there was the new Greek colleague with the first name of Euclid, and he showed a rather conventional behavior amongst finance ministers, I have to say, more conventional than his predecessor, who was an eminent economist after all. And he said that the Greeks knew that they have to rebuild trust that had been lost. Now, of course, I don't know when we're going to get the proposals from Greece. Mr. Moscovici said the deadline would be midnight, but we also have to see what's in them. And I said to Euclid at the time, let me make a proposal. If you really want to regain trust, why don't you just do something? Go in front of your parliament tomorrow and just do it. Just implement a measure. Because, you know, Michel Sapin said it. It wasn't me. I'm just quoting my French friend here. They didn't do anything except throwing out French consultants on tax reforms. Now, I haven't heard anything about a measure being introduced in the Greek parliament since Monday, and I can remember that all the Greek programs and in all other programs as well, that worked, by the way, Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus, and this proves the point. But we always say there need to be prior actions. That is, measures implemented to build trust. And I don't see any prior actions here. And my imagination as to how we can actually get these prior actions between now and Sunday is rather limited, I have to say. So again, to come back to the question you asked at the beginning for this debate, namely, what can we do, what can policymakers do to safeguard Europe against future crises? I would say create institutions that make it possible for us to make sure that the rules we give ourselves are complied with as a basis of trust, and making sure that we reduce any disincentives and increase incentives for right decisions. Now, in the days to come, I have to tackle various issues like funding between the German lender, and transparency is an issue there. But transparency is definitely something that we need to have across the board. Of course, we need more commonalities, we need more solidarity in Europe, an exchange between the stronger ones and the weaker ones. But there mustn't be any disincentives, meaning that the weaker ones think they don't have to make an effort. But instead, we have to make sure that the specific requirements of Europe, and we need to repeat that time and time again, as compared to other industrialized countries, the Eurozone or Europe, continental Europe, at least, as a relation to the GDP, the social spending is twice as high as the United States, that of the United States or Canada. We're much more risk-averse than other highly industrialized countries, and we have a much more difficult demographic situation than other parts of the world. And this world, which is becoming more interdependent, needs to be one where we shape the opportunities of the future for Europeans, and we need to be dynamic, and we need to look for sustainable growth. That is the decisive question. And maybe we can kick the can down the road for a bit, but that won't solve any problems. And I think it's time now to take a further step to strengthen the European Monetary Union.
Well, thank you very much for your introductory statement, Mr. Schäuble. I find it very pleasing to note that at the end of your statement, you referred to concrete details. You mentioned what happens when the players don't stick to the rules and how difficult it is to build up confidence again. Now, the subject of our session here is, in fact, turning points in history. Of our conference, in fact. Now, today, with reference to the Euro area or the EU, are, in fact, we just before a turning point of this kind on Sunday evening? Is that imminent? What about the President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker? He said that no matter what happens, Sunday will be a turning point. He didn't say in what direction the point would turn, but perhaps you could comment on this. Mr. Schäuble, are you asking me? Well, if you ask me, we've got to consider the acute problem of Greece at the moment. The banks are closed, capital controls have been introduced, moderate capital controls. Nobody knows when the bank holiday is going to end. This can go on for a long time. I don't know, however, whether this is a turning point in history or not. I'll be cautious in saying that. We must, in fact, use this as an opportunity to shore up the structure of the union in terms of fiscal union, monetary union. And when you consider the UK as well, if we make sure that they remain committed to Europe, then it might be a turning point in history. But if you don't mind, I must refer now to what is happening in China at the moment. That is just as much a turning point in history, you know, because you can see beyond the euro area, there are problems too. If people think that on the basis of monetary and fiscal policy, too much could be done in terms of economic policy, and that, well, of course, we can't refer to this here because monetary policy is the remit of the central banks here. But if I were allowed to air my opinion on this, and I did in Dresden at the G7 meeting, then I would say that you could look at the points on the surveys carried out by Eichengreen, and you can see the correlation with respect to the dip in growth. That is, all these efforts to create more and more fiscal incentives We have in fact had plenty of measures to cut deficits, and in fact these efforts have been in fact never been so active since World War II. And in fact it's not a question of not having enough liquidity in the financial markets, in the monetary markets. This is not the reason for a lack of growth. Perhaps we've had too many crises and volatility. Perhaps we haven't, however, understood how the digitalization process has changed the underlying structures. So perhaps we try simply to believe in the older rules, and of course that ends up being a moral hazard, as I said. Therefore, it is more important to focus on the real problems and to create the wherewithal for sustainable growth. Moreover, we must do so in such a way that the gap between the developing world, the emerging economies, and the developed world does not widen. Otherwise, we'll have more and more problems than what we expected would happen a few years ago. Well, with respect to what is happening in China at the moment, you said that this may also be a turning point. However, your remit and that of Michel Sapin in Europe, and of course there are decisive decisions ahead. I have every respect for the achievements and the creation of the Eurozone. But when you look around Europe at the moment, not only in Greece but in other countries, you have the impression that Europe is dividing people and not uniting people. You have said you've got to stick to the rules, and there have to be rules. But in fact, people now are permanently breaking these rules and not sticking to that principle. So what instruments are there to make sure that we can apply the right discipline? Or one day, will we have to come to the conclusion that, in fact, if you belong to the Eurozone, this is not chipped in stone, and we've got to introduce new rules with respect to the Euro area? I'd just like to make one comment. Try twisting Monsieur Sapin's arm. I'm not going to go into the details of what we're going to be preparing at the Euro Summit next week. I've got to try nevertheless. Try with Mr. Sapin. Yes, of course. This is a question that everyone here in the room would be very interested in discussing. It's being discussed, in fact, elsewhere as well. Mr. Sapin, would you like to comment? Well, thank you. I'll be as cautious as Wolfgang, I must say. There are things which are decided and have to be decided at the right place. Of course, not behind closed doors, just for the sake of closing doors, but because of the respect one has for institutions and mechanisms and the respect for the rules. That is, we've got to work together to find the right solutions, despite the fact that it may be an acute crisis and you're very curious. Now, what about this turning point question? Is this a turning point or not? Well, I'm not awfully keen on this word turning point, really. Because when you start turning, you turn in the opposite direction, then you go back in the other direction. It's like a zigzag. I think good policies are sustainable, are continuous, and they lead in a straight line. So I would say, or I would put the question as follows: how can we weather this time at the moment, this moment in the course of European integration, especially with respect to EMU, European Monetary Union? And this is what we've got to focus our energy on. And in fact, this is one of the issues raised by Greece. The treaty says that accession to the euro is irrevocable. That's the term used in the treaty. Irrevocable. Now, we know what that means, don't we? Now, if, by chance, and by the way, this is something no one wants, if this treaty were violated, from that point of view, if all of a sudden we note that a country can leave the euro, this would, in fact, be to undermine the overall credibility of our path of European integration. However, if a country remains within the euro because we are afraid that the credibility of the euro will be lost, even if they don't respect the rules, if they don't follow a path of convergence with us, this would also be calling into question the credibility of the euro. So we've got to strike a right balance here. So all I can say is that the right approach is for the governments concerned, or the government concerned at the moment, should assume the responsibility, but it should not be assumed from the outside. They should have the responsibility to take ambitious, courageous, difficult decisions. We have this in France as well, of course. It's not comparable to the situation in Greece, but the government should take the right decisions with the necessary political authority, seeking what is necessary in terms of national cohesion to find credibility for the country and for the overall system. So they should move in that direction. This is why I want us to get through this difficult period so that the euro area will be fully respected and so that the rules of credibility of the euro area will be respected. You can't simply stay in the euro system because you love it or because it's an easier option. No, you're there because you've accepted the overall rules with what this means in terms of responsibility you must shoulder. Now, Wolfgang, you talked about solidarity. That is part and parcel of European integration. But we cannot have solidarity if you do not accept responsibility. You cannot express solidarity towards a country which does not assume its responsibility. If a country shoulders its responsibility, has right to solidarity. And this is at the very heart of the discourse I think we adopt at the moment. And I would like Greece to follow in that direction. Moreover, over and above that, it's a question of deepening. Whether or not we're talking about Greece, even if there have been no crisis in Greece, we must deepen economic and monetary union, regardless of this. I was around at the time of the Treaty of Maastricht. EMU was set up, the economic pillar, the monetary aspect. So when you consider the monetary pillar, you know, it was specified to the very last detail. And beside that, there was the second pillar, where we just had the basic title. This will be built afterwards, no details. And this was not done because the monetary union worked so well that it afforded a type of protection. It was like an anesthetic almost. Let's not go any further in the economic field, but we know that the anesthetic has worn off, and it's painful now. It will be painful if we cannot apply convergence to the economic pillar. So we've really got to move forward, perhaps even more quickly than we can imagine at the moment in deepening EMU.
Well, thank you very much. Coming back to the topic of deepening, the topic that you just mentioned, I'd like to come back to that. How is it that you can deepen a monetary union if in many countries, member countries of the Eurozone, there are misgivings concerning where to go? Now, there are a number of misgivings in many countries against further integration, a deepening of the union on our road to a fiscal union, maybe even a political union. Now, what would be the concrete steps towards such a deepening of the union? Question to you, Minister Sapin, and I'm sure that Mr. Schäuble wants to answer that as well.
Well, to be absolutely honest, well, we're not just among ourselves, are we? But I'll be as frank as possible. The most difficult, or this is the most difficult time to deepen. Because when you say deepen, what does this mean? It means to transfer competences. Let's call a spade. We have transferred monetary competences. In the banking field, even if the process is not yet concluded, we have transferred competence. So if we want to deepen, we've got to transfer competence. Now, I'm saying this at a time when people are suffering, they're asking or questioning their own identity, they're questioning the idea of nation, where do we come from, where are we going to? It's a question of identity. And when you think of the populists and the nationalists in the countries, this is a context which is not at all conducive to convince people that we should have a policy of deepening, because part of our nations are suffering. So what is the response? This is in fact outlined in the 5 Presidents' report. We need 2 steps. Firstly, we do all we can within the treaties as they stand at the moment. Banking, capital union, fight against fraud, tax fraud, etc., etc. There are other aspects as well, so we go as far as possible, as quickly as possible. And then, at one point, the economy will be in a better state. People then will begin to love Europe again, and then we can move to the next phase, the next stage. But this phase will take place, because if we do not deepen the institutions, we will come up against the limits of the current system very quickly. Thank you. Now, Mr. Schäuble, before giving you the floor, I'd just like to add the following. Having noted that the current institutions and the current constitution of the Eurozone has deficits, would it not be better to press the reset button so that the institutions we have would then reapply the rules, that is, between bailout rules and so on and so forth? These have already been mentioned here. So it seems that we haven't been in a situation where we've not been complying with the rules.
I understood you as asking another follow-up question to Monsieur Sapin. Well, now, to answer your question directly, I'm not in favor of pushing the reset button. I totally agree with everything that Michel Sapin said. Of course, you're right with your question, and the answer was given accordingly. In almost all countries, I would say, there is a growing level of uncertainty, skepticism, dissatisfaction for many serious, understandable reasons. But, and this is in fact the task of political leaders, we have to be aware of the fact that we are living in a democracy. And this is why we have to respect the fact that, as I said, it was at the time too early to transfer national sovereignty in military and defense matters to a European institution. I think if we act in an intelligent way, I think we can take a two-staged approach, which is something that the 5 Presidents' report also outlines, as Michel Sapin just said. So with the banking union, for example, we've treaded that path already. Now when it comes to tax evasion, for example, in an increasingly globalized economy and financial world, we have to make sure that the possibilities of minimizing a tax burden through taking certain measures is limited, so that it mustn't only be the task of authorities to find out who is trying to bend the rules, but instead we have to incentivize innovation and growth potential derived from that. And this is why, well, I'm not quite so pessimistic. Quite the contrary is the case. I think in times when things go right, and we can see that in many other European democracies, I think readiness for change of governments on the part of governments is rather low. That's just normal human behavior, you know. When everything is okay, people think, well, never change a running system. And I think that Europe makes progress at times of crisis, and this is why I'm not quite so pessimistic. But I would like to underline one thing that is creating major problems these days and which makes things very difficult indeed. Now, it may be a very legal point to you, but in fact it's not. Of course, integration is only possible by strengthening European institutions. And here we're talking about the Commission and the Parliament, of course, and this is why Michel Sapin just said, well, we have to transfer authorities at some point. If you don't want that, you can just, you know, leave things as they are, because that's another topic that cannot be, you know, pushed forward then, says Mr. Döring. No, the contrary is the case. We are discussing things, namely thinking back to the Lisbon Treaty. The European Commission has a dual function. Of course, it is the guardian of treaties, initiating deficit procedure, deciding whether things are okay or not, and also thinking of, you know, the president of the Commission. You know what I'm talking about here. And Juncker is interpreting the political role of the European Commission, quite rightly so, I believe. But in so doing, the other function is getting a bit tricky. In Germany, for example, when it comes to infringements of competition law, then institutions have a say that are not, in fact, the ones who should make that decision. And there should be a greater distinction to be made here. Now, objective function and subjective functions in Europe. Otherwise, and I'm not going to go into detail here, otherwise the situation will be such that we cannot trust the neutrality of the institutions we have. And that's a very severe problem, and it makes it harder for us to make progress in terms of institutions. Thank you very much, Mr. Schäuble. I really have to look at my watch here, because Minister Sapin has to leave shortly after 4 o'clock, and I had promised you to be able to ask questions. So now this opens the question and answer session. Please also state your name and the institution you are representing. Thank you.
Mr. Eichengreen.
Barry Eichengreen. I have 2 very brief questions. Question number 1, there does seem to be some daylight between the 2 gentlemen on the question of fiscal union and how fast Europe needs to move toward deeper fiscal integration, with Mr. Sapin preferring more speed than Mr. Schäuble. Question number 2, Donald Tusk, Christine Lagarde, Jacques Lew have all spoken about the issue, about Greece's need for debt relief in recent days. Could the gentleman speak about it as well?
Dann habe ich mich falsch ausgedrückt. Wenn Sie mich so verstanden
Now,
haben,
if you understood me
dass ich
as having said that I am in favor of slower steps towards a fiscal union than Michel Sapin, then I did not find the right words here. Everybody who knows me, and if you know Michel Sapin, you know we are always of the same opinion, but if somebody is more pressing, it would be me. I'm older as well, and I'm more impatient for that reason. And, you know, I'm said to be a person who, even in my own party, you know, that is the reason why people were looking at me with maybe too much attention. And by the way, the IMF has always warned me not to show too much generosity vis-à-vis Greece. So the image I have in Greece, but you know, some people are better in terms of propaganda and demagogy than others, and I'm not surprised at that, but I am, in fact, the person who has always been trying to help. But that's not the decisive point here. Well, of course, the strong role of the IMF in all of these rescue measures has to do with this problem that I just described, meaning that we do not have enough trust in the objectiveness of European institutions. We cannot have that trust. Thinking back to the history of the European rescue system, you would know what I'm referring to. You know, there's somebody sitting here who didn't want the IMF in the first place, but the German Chancellor said we need the IMF. Without the IMF, we cannot trust the European Commission, and she was right. Now, so much for your question. Now, debt sustainability is not feasible without a haircut. And I think the IMF is correct in saying that. But I'm also saying, and I think that Michel Sapin agrees with me, he gave an interview to a radio station, I think, France 4, whatever it was. He said that in the case of sovereign debt, there cannot be a haircut because it would infringe the system of the European Union. After all, the European Union is a community of common laws. Now, reprofiling of debts, if you cannot do a haircut, you might opt for that. Well, I think in 2012 already we took things further than the IMF, and I was there. I was there at all these all-night meetings, and I know what I'm talking about, and we just about managed to get things right. So I think the leeway we have thanks to the restructuring of debt or reprofiling of debt is very low. And in the days to come, we will, of course, discuss whether there is an option still. But I'm more skeptical in that respect than Michel Sapin. Thank you very much. Is there any other question from the audience? I cannot really see you here because of the light. Mr. Friedman.
Question for Mr. Schäuble. In light of Germany's history in the last century, 1922, 1924, 1933, and above all 1953, isn't it up to Germany to take the lead in doing whatever is needed to restructure or reduce the German debt? You were very eloquent a moment ago on the inconsistency with the European rules of having a haircut for sovereign member states. But rules are come and go, and we saw again in Germany's history in the 20th century that there were lots of things done to restructure the German debt that could have been construed as not within the rules of the day. And they were done, and they were done with the explicit understanding, especially in the 1953 agreement, that the German public had suffered enough, which surely was right, and therefore German standards of living should not be further reduced. Isn't it now up to Germany to take the lead in finding some way to make this happen?
Mr. Friedman, thank you. With all due respect, Mr. Friedman, I don't think the comparison with the 1920s or 1953 or whatever is quite the same as the situation that we have had in the last few years with the euro and EMU. Indeed, I think this is misleading, with all due respect, sir. The German public is aware of this. I'm interested in history, and I could go on about this at length, but I shall spare you that. However, the problem is this. It's not comparable. In 2009, before the euro crisis, Greece, for many years, had not been competitive. They have an institutional framework which, in fact, does not correspond to the minimum requirements of a developed economy. In 2009, they had a budgetary deficit of 15% GDP and over 15% of 2009 for another key economic indicator. So the Greek finance minister, that was a current account deficit. The Greek finance minister, I'm not sure what his second name is, but he said on Tuesday, and Michel was there, so he is witness to this. If, in fact, we are relieved of all our debt, and in fact, we have, in fact, already given them a considerable debt relief, we will have the same problems in 3 years' time, because our economy is not competitive. This is why, with all due respect, the comparisons are misleading. But let's not go into the history of the errors committed at the end of the First World War. If you like, we could talk about the disaster of Hitler and the Nazis in the Second World War, and the very wise decisions taken by the Allies, at least in the western part of Germany. But finally, I'd just like to say that the conditions at the time were not the membership of a monetary union, and the no bailout provisions refer to the monetary union, and these are necessary so that the monetary union can imagine. Look, in the States, you cannot imagine what a monetary union means, but recently I talked to Jacques Lou, my friend, and I referred to Puerto Rico. I said, oh, we could take them into the Eurozone if the US accepted Greece in the dollar area. He thought I was joking. Well, of course, politicians often come up with innovative ideas. We're pressed for time, so I'll give someone the floor there. Who was asking for the floor there? Microphone's on its way.
My name is Francesco Papadia, and I think the Greek crisis has shown clearly that the progress that has been made since, say, 2008 to move towards a more perfect monetary union has been insufficient. Now, can we interpret what you said today from you, the finance minister of the two leading countries in Europe, that soon you will announce measures to perfect the banking and fiscal union in order to remedy the defects that have been shown? So we expect concrete announcement soon. Is that the interpretation of your statements?
Yeah. Mr. Sapin.
J'adore les encouragements.
I adore encouragement, I must say. Thank you very much for your proactive question, your encouraging question. I come from the country where we had the French Revolution, after all, so I will try to answer this. It is indispensable. Indispensable. You cannot shirk this. Even if you do want to shirk this difficulty, it is insurmountable, the deepening. And in fact, it means not only a turning point, but a new step, a milestone in European integration is ahead of us. The only thing I'm saying, we're both saying, is that if we want to zap through too quickly, we will burn our fingers. And I have seen this myself in my own country. A few years ago, indeed, you've got to respect the order of the steps. So the first step is to go as far as possible in terms of the treaties today, and there is a headway for that. There is elbow room, and we have mentioned this. In fact, we have put forward a number of joint proposals to the institutions, the Commission, the Council, sometimes the European Parliament, to make headway. So first of all, we must deepen insofar as it's possible until we get to the limits where we need to amend the treaties. But at some point, we will have to amend the treaties so that competences, including budgetary competences, can be transferred. It's not simple from the budgetary point of view. I referred to the French Revolution. In the Declaration of Human Rights, we have an article which stipulates the Parliament adopts the budget and authorizes the expenses and income. So this is in our constitutions. These are fundamental principles. So in this step ahead of us, we've got to respect our identities. At the same time, we have got to go through these additional steps if we want to have robust tools to safeguard ourselves against today's crisis or crises in the future. There may be crises from the outside or geopolitical crises. Very often, we have seen this too often in Europe, so we've got to be strong enough to weather all these crises. Just like to add a word, says Mr. Schäuble in French. I agree. Better now than the day, well, better tomorrow rather than the day after tomorrow. In other words, the sooner the better. Well, thank you very much, ministers. Thank you to you all. Could I just add one final word, says Mr. Sapin? Champagne doesn't age very well, you know. So I haven't bought the crates of champagne I promised, but I'm thinking about it. And as Wolfgang Schäuble would say, I'm thinking about doing so tomorrow and not the day after tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank auch für Ihre
Thank you
Diskussionsfreude und
for being so lively in the discussion. And on your homepage, Mr. Schäuble, I saw something interesting which you quote there. It says, governing is a rendezvous with reality. We know that you have quite a few of these rendezvous ahead of you, so wish you all the best. Let's hope you won't be disappointed. All the best, as I said. Thank you, both ministers, for having been here today. And I wish you a safe trip back to your capitals. We're now going to have a coffee break until 16:30, 4:30. Thank you for your attention.